François Grünewald, who's on my far right here. He's the executive and scientific director at Groupe URD. François has over 30 years of experience working on development, emergency, and post-disaster rehabilitation projects in Africa, Asia, Central Europe, Central and Latin America, basically all over the world. He's written several books and many articles, and he's been working on humanitarian aid in urban settings since the early 1990s. Now, François is going to take a slightly wider perspective on how the humanitarian community is responding to humanitarian needs in different urban areas, drawing on Groupe URD's research and evaluations for ECHO and other agencies. François.
Thank you very much. Yeah, for those who don't know us, Groupe URD is a little French brother of HPG, ODI. One of the big differences is, as we are in a farm in Provence, we are self-sufficient in olive oil, apricot jam, and honey.
Very lucky.
Being the third of the Swiss speaker, I will try to find some different angles so that we don't repeat what have been said, which, by the way, I fully agree in almost all elements. Maybe I will start with a challenge. Why are we, humanitarian sector, slowly discovering the challenge of cities? Because if we look at history, war and disaster have been the friends of society since the beginning. War started about cities. By the way, the same as money started about cities. So we are discovering now that cities are monetized systems. No, cities were the place where money was created 6 or more thousand years ago. So we are discovering many things, which I think it's interesting. Cities were linked to war, first of all, because when there was a war in the countryside, people tried to move to the city to get protection. Cities were also the place where wealth and power were accumulated. So if you want to control that new country, better to control the cities. And histories over the last few centuries, not century, 1,000 years has been made of war to capture cities. Most of the war of the recent history have been about capturing cities. What happened is the post-colonial wars and the post-colonial and the Cold War conflict were all urban, no, all rural. Sorry, all urban. So suddenly, the war in the city disappeared from the radar screen. We are all working in rural countryside where the conflict was taking place in Angola, in Mozambique, in Afghanistan. And cities faded away from the humanitarian radar screen. Even if there were some big disaster that regularly brought cities back, the Managua earthquake, for those who know Managua, it's one of those strange places where the addresses are labeled like Don de Foy, where this place used to be before the earthquake. So it's interesting. It has such an impact on history. But we had also El Asnar in Algeria. We had big Mexico earthquake. So humanitarian aid was from time to time brought into cities. But interesting enough, it was not the NGO actors. It was sometimes the Red Cross family. Most of the time, the civil protection actors were on board. And the NGO community were very rarely involved in those natural disasters in cities. Then Sarajevo, Grozny, Wambo, the first wars of Mogadishu, slowly brought the cities into the radar screen. But very few actors decided that it was a specific challenge. In fact, probably only ICRC at that time decided that because of its old history of doing work in cities, had to develop and finally developed a real city approach during that time. For most of the other agencies, it was like a big refugee camp where we had distributing goodies and in Kabul digging wells and not understanding what were the specific challenges of working in the city. When we did the report after 3 months in Port-au-Prince, we came with a big conclusion. Most of the problem the humanitarian sector had and will continue to have in Port-au-Prince are linked to the absence of urban lens. We don't look at cities with the tools that allow us to understand what a city is about. Because a city is something, it's a very special type of animal. It's an historical and social construction before being walls and streets. It's an historical and cultural construction. It's a place where power functions through very specific ways and institutions, municipal, etc., which often are in opposition with the government. So you can have good relations with the ministries at the central level, but the mayor is from the opposite side, from the opposite party. So you have very specific political situation. It's a very specific society made of multi-layers. You have the old city inhabitants, you have the new rural migrants, you have all kinds of faces. Couple of years ago, when we observed a big humanitarian organization doing a study on Kabul, they try to apply the kind of the classical randomized procedure to identify malnutrition in Kabul. And we told them, with that approach, you will go to nowhere. And of course, at the end, they came to the conclusion that it's likely, but they cannot prove it, that the more vulnerable are those who are affected by the biggest problem of food. And we told them, instead of looking at Kabul as an homogeneous city, you would have looked at, you have the Pashtun area, you have the Hazara area where people have been moving 3 times because they have been bombed. You have the Tajik place, all those places with a different history, different economic setup, a different historical construction. And in each of these situations, vulnerability, poverty, and malnutrition is different. And you can just not look at Kabul as an homogeneous place. So cities are very diversified, and often we look at them as the city. That doesn't work. Another place is that a city does not function like most villages, like a village. It's a place where everything functions through networks, social networks, physical networks for water, sewage, and electricity. So you cannot, most of the classical techniques of the humanitarian actors, drilling a well, digging a well, putting some pit latrines, that just does not work in cities. And so we were confronted to lack of very low adaptation of our tools to this historical, social, and cultural construction. There are a few other characteristics which are important. In a city, everything is big. You know, a village, you have a few hundred, sometimes few thousand in a big village. In a city, immediately you count by 10,000, 100,000. Cities are big. Cities can be dangerous. It has been mentioned earlier. Cities are extremely dynamic. In rural settings, most of the evolution is linked to seasonal and agricultural patterns. In city, things change just like that. It's much more dynamic. And sometimes, and we have seen that in many situations, the humanitarian actors, they arrive with humanitarian goodies to distribute when the population have already moved to the reconstruction. So we are late because things change so fast in cities. And it has been mentioned there are a lot of opportunities. Cities are a place of a lot of creativity, a lot of ingenuity, a lot of imagination, cart redistribution all the time. This is what cities are about. So we arrive often with difficulties to understand how it functions, how to put our energies. And again, the analysis of those situations is very interesting. When we did a study on Mogadishu a year and a half ago, it was very interesting because we started to analyze all the different rings of construction of Mogadishu from the time it was just a small village to the time it became an Italian city, and And if you look at that, then you identify immediately the problems of water, sanitation, social conflict. It's readable on the map. So it's something interesting. I will just focus my two last point on three specific issues. We are doing some work with Wendy on Syria and building up on some of our previous work on war in cities. We published a book on that 10 years ago, War in Cities, Cities at War, and we have been continuing the research. War in the city is something very special, very particular. First of all, it's very interesting if you look at the literature produced by the military of the last 10 years. The growth of research on doctrines on war in cities is just like that. Because for them, it's a big challenge. It's the most dangerous war for them, for the militaries, war in cities. And of course, they respond by massive bombing, because this is the only way they will overrun smaller forces, which can go into this kind of landscape we have on the wall there. So the response is massive bombing. In front of that, they have groups which are extremely mobile, using booby traps all the time. So war in city is something which is very, very, very particular. Survival in a city at war for the population is something absolutely incredible. How people wake up during the night, go to the little place where they have water. They just fill the jerry cans and come back. Use every single opportunity where there is some. I find myself a couple of times staying some days or weeks in those contexts, and I've been amazed by the capacity of population to survive in those cities. But these are places where it's very difficult to work for us. We have the zero casualty doctrine for all of us. So when it becomes dangerous, we don't go. And some agencies are trying to find proxies. So how to support those who can go or are there to do things. But it's very complicated. If you get shot by a straight bullet in a city, it's very easy to die. Even if it's something very easy to cure, very easy to not to die, if people would know the right gesture to do. If people around you don't know what to do, you just die by simple bullet wound that would normally not kill you, because you cannot not access any type of relief and medical intervention. So it's quite complicated to survive and for us to intervene in those cities. Very interesting. The scars of the war in the city is something very, very fascinating. Those of you who have been looking at what is called BAC, Battle Area Clearance, which most of people call that demining, but in city it's not demining. It's looking at munitions and booby traps, unexploded munitions and booby traps, so that the danger can be removed for those who will come after and try to resettle. And it's very, very difficult work to do, and and probably cities in Syria will remain extremely dangerous long after the war will be finished. So war in cities. For me, it's an area where we have to do a lot of progress and very rapidly, because this will be critical. Maybe the last point. One of the you have been mentioning the whole issue of mobile technologies, and there's one very interesting technology which is very helpful to understand how a city has been affected by conflict or disaster: satellite imageries. And this is an area where we have not invested enough. It's a place, it's a tool that help us quite rapidly to do the mapping, and we can overlay it through other types of maps, including old maps that can help us. Most of those cities have had the water system, sewage system, electricity system done by commercial companies. most of the time the archives are available somewhere. And we can identify it and use it instead of often going blind and trying to look for a place where we can drill our wells. Most of the time those networks exist and they have been mapped and those maps are available. So the proactive part of what we should do before intervening in a city is critical. The understanding we can have, most of those cities have been studied somewhere, most of the data are available somewhere, at least on infrastructures, and most of the mapping of the different areas are available somewhere. We have to do more effort in preparing ourselves before entering into those cities, and I stop here.
Thank you very much, François. Provocative presentation as usual, and very interesting. And I think focusing on the history of cities and war in cities, looking at the cultural and social constructions and how you have to deconstruct that in order to really understand the context is important. And I think also pointing out that much of the information that we need is already there if we know where to look for it, if we try to look for it. There's so much more in your presentation that I'd like to summarize, but I want to leave a lot of time for, as much time as possible, for questions and comments. I'm going to move straight on to that. We've had 3 interesting presentations. We have now about 30 minutes, possibly 35, for questions and comments. So I'll open the floor now. If you could please say who you are, and if you have an organizational affiliation, keep your question or comment very short and to the point. And if you're going to direct it at a specific speaker, please name them. The floor is now open, and that's also for our online audience.